I'm going to start today's podcast off. Usually Sina does that, but since he's MIA because of very demanding work obligations, I'll be setting off the podcast today. It's an honor to be joined by Mr. Dr. Omid Furutan. He's a professor of management at the University of La Verne, and he's also my father. He has his most recent publication, and I forgot the exact name of the title right now, but it was about the tolerance towards scholar dishonesty and the relationship it has to dishonesty in the workplace. I read through most of it and it was very interesting, and I'm certain that it will also come up during the conversation of this podcast. And I'm also joined by Dr. Derik Smith, a professor of literature at the Claremont McKenna College, and his most recent works include a book called Robert Hayden in Verse: New Histories of African American Poetry and the Black Arts Era, and also many peer-reviewed articles, one of which is Seeding the Future, a response to Ta-Nehisi quotes Between the World and Me. I also read through that one in particular, not everything, but most of it, and I actually had one or two specific questions about that because I was interested in some stuff. But without further ado, I think we can get started.
Thanks, Bayan, for the introduction. Happy to be here with you on the podcast.
Yeah, same here. Although you did murder the title of my project and paper. But
I'm sorry. Your bio didn't
fine.
I read it earlier, but your bio didn't have the title in there, and I forgot to pull it up right now when I was doing the introduction.
No, that's fine. You got the gist of it.
Okay, so I don't know if maybe we want to jump right into it. Maybe we can just start with, how have things been for you two as college professors in recent times, both with COVID-related things going on of, working remotely, and obviously the racial tensions. How has it been for either of you at the universities?
You can start, Derik, if you like.
All right, so I'll start by talking a little bit about the transition into the COVID era. Let's say it kind of happened midway through the spring semester for me. So my classes were meeting face to face up until the spring break, which would have been, what would that have been? Sometime in April? I guess no, earlier than that, March. And then after that, we transitioned over into this kind of format that we're using right now with Zoom, and that presented a lot of difficulties. I think that it cut down on some of the dynamism of the classroom experience. The kind of classes that I teach are pretty conversational. It's based on give and take between students and professor, and so that was a little bit hard to adjust to. However, one of the classes that I teach is it is part of a program at the colleges where I work. It's called the Justice Education Initiative, and so the class is kind of focused on issues coming out of mostly the criminal justice system in the U.S. And I was teaching a class called American Prison Texts. And once we moved over into this totally virtual format, I then began to emphasize in the way that we approach the material a focus on the internet as the place of social interaction. And so then I actually encouraged my students to begin to think through the issues that we had been dealing with in the class on American prison text through their social media engagements. And in fact, that actually led to, I think, the flourishing of that class. That class it was good in terms of establishing a theoretical foundation in the first half and the face-to-face engagements that we did. But then in the second half of the semester, the class actually became a lot more praxis oriented, where students were putting their knowledge into, let's say, the marketplace of ideas that exists on the internet. And that actually led them into a kind of almost a deeper engagement with the material. So by happenstance, I actually think that in that particular course, the advent of the sort of COVID era and online teaching was helpful in some ways. In terms of the contemporary moment that we're dealing with over the last couple of weeks and the real intense and enhanced engagement with issues around race and anti-Blackness, it's led to me being a very busy person, really taking on a lot of kinds of responsibilities within the college context, particularly in my role as a member of the Intercollegiate Department of Africana Studies at the Claremont Colleges, where I'm about to be the chair of that department. And so there's a lot of things that have to happen, now, because it's a pregnant opportunity, right? I mean, it's like one where we can go forward and maybe press forward on a lot of the agenda items that have been there in terms of the Africana department and its desire to see policy changes at the college, but people have not heretofore been as open to some of the ideas that we would like to see advanced as they are now, right? So this is a kind of really exciting, also a very busy and sort of somewhat stressful kind of period over the last few weeks. Sorry, you said there's a long form podcast, so I went long form with the answer. I'll try not to do that again. Sorry.
No, we have all the time in the world. Don't even worry about it.
All right, so I'm going to get with my long answer as well. I think very similar to what Derik was saying as far as COVID-19 is concerned. We were one of the, I think, early universities that decided to go online. I think later on, 2 to 3 weeks afterwards, other universities decided to follow suit. Partially because we're so small. Our main campus is about 4,000 students, entire university 8,000. Our classrooms are no more than 25. We are a little bit nimble, so we can move quickly one way or another. So we decided to go on the Zoom format, as Derik has mentioned, online format. Two things became clear when we did that. Actually, several things, but two things jumps to my mind. One is that the educational system has been so deeply rooted in the traditional model that it was very difficult for many professors to adjust to this new distance learning, ability to connect to students outside of the classroom. One could say most of these professors were like professors who've been teaching for years and years, closer to their retirement. So they did not have the skills maybe than the younger professor who have been recently hired. So one definitely is that. But the second, I think, part of that is that the belief that education, and to a certain degree, of course, is correct, that education has to be delivered in a way that requires the presence of the professor and the students to be in the same room. Naturally, that gives a level of interaction and engagement which you cannot replicate. So that is clear. But unfortunately, this model, this we understand now very clearly, is so limited to access of privilege. In other words, those who have the ability to pay the tuition, those who have the ability to have transport to come to classrooms, those who have the ability to not work and go full-time to school, and therefore go to the traditional model of everyday classes from this hour in the morning to that hour in the afternoon. that it did cut a lot of access from the other sector of society that would not be able to participate in that type of educational process. Of course, universities such as University of Phoenix and others have online classes, or many of the universities have evening classes, but those are afterthoughts. That's not the main program. That's not the main purpose or the main function or the main mission of large universities, of universities that are ranked, that are considered to be quality education. Their main concern is the traditional undergrad, the traditional graduate student, the traditional PhD student. And so we have this cycle of privilege that education become accessible to very specific part of society, which has also an economic impact on those sectors of society that don't have access. So that's something that became kind of a little bit clear to me during this process. The second thing that also I thought about is that even in this country, one would consider United States to be one of the most privileged, wealthiest countries in the world. We have a clear digital divide. Those who have technology, equipment, and broadband access to be able to benefit from what broadband, brings to their lives, such as education, and those that literally have very little to no access. And I didn't think, at least in our student body, I will see any of that. I thought everyone would have, the best equipment, the best broadband, and we won't have any problems. I noticed that was not the case. Now, given that mainly our students are first generation Hispanic students, so one would say in that community, access would be less than what perhaps Derik experiences with his students, because Claremont colleges, correct me if I'm wrong, Derik, that usually they come from wealthier backgrounds than University of La Verne would. As such, I saw this digital divide, and I saw students who had no problems, no issues with access. And then others who had to borrow equipment from family members and go to public places where Wi-Fi was available. And again, that put extra pressure on these students trying to engage in a classroom where others were sitting comfortably on their couches in their beautiful homes and just accessing from their private bedrooms the classroom. So those became clear to me that still we have a long ways to go to make education, which to me is human rights privilege, is a human rights issue, to make education as a leveling field for everyone. Everyone would have access to equal opportunity to engage and to improve themselves. And that thing became really clear to me. The second thing, which is what we're seeing today, in regards to anti-Blackness and Black Lives Matter. I just want to differentiate the way you labeled it. You said racial tensions when we started. You said the issues of racial tensions. I would label it a little bit differently because I'm understanding it differently. I would label it racial awakening. I think United States or people in America, especially, I would say middle class, white, young, that category specifically, is waking up to a specific reality of racial reality in the United States, which they were maybe not as aware. They were kind of like they were sleeping. And that doesn't mean they were bad. That doesn't mean they didn't want to wake up, but they were just sleeping, which had to do a lot of with the conditions of society and how they were raised in this particular timeline. But I think they woke up. I don't want to use the word woke because I know woke is very loaded and it has a lot of both negative and positive. I've come to learn that this word woke was actually a word that the African American community used way back in the 50s and 60s, and it meant something very specific, but maybe a little bit of the left-wing people stole it and used it a little bit differently now, so it is a very loaded word. But what I mean is that people woke up and they became really sensitive to issues which the Black body was experiencing for years, I mean, for generations. And now they want to stand up. And a lot of people say allies. I'm not really keen to that word. You know, they say we are becoming allies to our Black brothers and sisters. I think that's partially true, but I think that I would label it more like fellow soldiers, because an ally also has the ability to move away, but now you're a fellow soldier. You're in this fight together. You're moving together. You're putting your body, just like soldiers, your body and his body both together are at front in harm's way, trying to push for a just cause. So I've seen it. I was actually with Derik. We both went, one of the marches that we both participated in was the one in Claremont. And both of us were, I would say, shocked, but in a good way, surprised in a good way, that people that you would never see before, you would have never saw, I mean, I never saw them in my life, and Derik probably can speak to this issue as well. All of a sudden, masses of white middle-class young people were on the streets, marching and singing, and I think they mean it. I felt a sense of sincerity that I had not seen before. Talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about racial justice, talking about racial unity in a way that I think puts us in a point in history that I personally in my life have never seen before. So this momentum, I think we need to use, I think we need to take advantage of, and we need to push forward as much as possible to get as close as we can to the racial unity and the racial justice that this community and this country deserves to be in.
One thing that's interesting from what you just said was, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about as well, and I was wondering how for either or both of you this plays into the most recent movement, which is the differentiation between, well, before I, maybe as a quick preface, so when I say identity politics, I mean politics that are based on, let's say, arbitrary characteristics, you know, someone's sexual orientation, someone's skin color, something like that, like where people coalesce together in order to advance the movement in the interest of those identities that come together. And as far as I have recently discovered, I would say there's two kind of main branches of identity politics. One being the common humanity identity politics, meaning that you appeal to a sense of common humanity and justice with people who do not partake in your identity. So, for example, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King was a herald of that, where he would appeal to the common humanity and emphasize that they would like to, as in the Black community during the 60s and before that, enjoy the same freedoms and the same sense of justice that their fellow white people had within the same country or community, where they expressed that we are the same as you and we want to be treated the same, so to speak. I'm grossly oversimplifying, but let's say that was kind of the heart of the message, the common humanity. And then there's another branch that could be described as the common enemy type identity politics. That would be I'm not necessarily commenting on this most recent one, but more recently, within the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the let's say previous social justice movement would involve things like, white shame, or kind of like an antagonistic point of view towards white people, where rather than appealing to the common humanity, they would coalesce against a common enemy and say, we don't want white people in charge anymore, or something like that, where they're not appealing to the humanity anymore, but rather coalescing to fight a common enemy. And I'm not implying that this is what you meant here, but more as a chance for clarification. When words such as allies or words such as fellow soldiers are used, it, in my head, would imply a sense of common enemy type identity politics, where you might say we're allies, meaning that the ones who wouldn't join are foes, or something like that, or we're fellow soldiers fighting against something. And so I don't know if that's necessarily how you meant it. I don't think so, because I know you personally well enough to know that. But for the sake of this podcast, how would you address that? Do you think that the most recent movement, as it pertains to, let's call it the George Floyd aftermath, falls more under the category of a common humanity type movement or a common enemy type movement? And that would be for either of you, but I'll give you, Omid, the chance first to respond, because it would be more directly related to what you just said.
Okay, thank you very much for asking me this. I'll make it as short as possible, because I really like to hear what Derik has to say about this as well. So you brought a lot of issues. You talked about identity politics. You talked about concepts of common humanity versus common enemy. You talked about the words that are used, such as allies and being fellow soldiers. So let me try to get through them one by one, unpack them, because there is a lot. Sometimes we think that there is a dichotomy in what we do. We do one thing, or we do another thing, or that we have to believe in this side, and if we do, that means the other side we don't believe in or must be wrong. That kind of a dichotomy, unfortunately, leads to the kind of identity politics that you're talking about, because identity politics is about us and them. It's because us versus them. This us and them can take shapes in very different ways. Us and them can even exist in a sports arena. As Derik and and I'll say it in this podcast because I want to promote this beautiful team called the Clippers, that chances are might win the championship this year. That even when you go there, you would see this concept of us and them, the Clippers fan versus the Lakers fan, or the Clippers fan versus. We see it in everything. We see it in our works. In our jobs, we have my department versus the other departments in our university, my university versus the other. So we all become parts of different circles. And then in these different circles, we somehow see us and them in that way. So this identity politics. Now, as far as this racial awakening is concerned, I think we don't have to have a dichotomy. We are fighting for our common humanity, and we are also fighting against a common enemy. Both are correct, but let me clarify. The common humanity has to do with us in this fight, which is not the racial identity, because you see whites, you see blacks, you see people of color of all different nationalities. You see women, you see men, you see young, you see old. I have seen, even when you get to political persuasions, I've seen Democrats, I've seen Republicans, I've seen liberals. They are all in this fight of common humanity. but they are also in the fight of a common enemy. But the enemy, I think the thing that I want to clarify, the enemy is not individuals. The enemy is, there are policies, there are racial policies. The enemy is the racial laws. The enemy is the institutionalized racism that has been ingrained and has been sowed in the fabric of this democracy for years, and to no fault of individuals, but fault of historical, evolutionary process that has taken place even before, we had pilgrims coming to this country. So the fight is against the policies, the fight is against the laws, the fight is against the institutionalized racism and not individuals. So the common humanity, which is all of us, can have that single enemy, which is the policy and the law. So that's one thing I wanted to clear, that we can have both. The second thing is, you talked about George Floyd. Let me just mention one thing. We all talk about George Floyd, and we're saying George Floyd was the reason behind everything we see. This is a common misconception, and this is dishonoring George Floyd's, let me use correct words here so it doesn't sound too radical this way, or George Floyd's death. I don't want to say killing, because then again, loaded words, and I don't want to get into that, although I do believe it was a killing, but George Floyd's death. George Floyd was what we call a trigger point. George Floyd is what in business we refer to as the tipping point, right? So in other words, is not because of George Floyd that all these things happen, is because of years and years and years and years of racial injustice. And George Floyd was that tipping point, that all of a sudden, that trigger point that brought this perfect storm together. And I think, by the way, the perfect storm, also COVID-19 was part of it. I think COVID-19 plus George Floyd all of a sudden erupted into what we're seeing today. So this is both to honor George Floyd for what has happened, but also to honor everyone else before him that brought us to this point. So that's another thing I wanted to say. And again, I stand by the word soldiers. I stand by it because what I said before and what I'm saying now, we are in a fight against laws and policies. We're not in fight against people. We're in fight against laws and policies to create racial justice, because unless you can create racial justice, it would be very difficult to achieve racial unity, and that's the common humanity. So the common humanity talks to racial unity concept, and we need to have that. That is an important common humanity cause that we need to go forward with. But that is intimately connected to what we call, or what we refer to as, racial justice. And racial justice is in a fight, you're right. And fight against what? Against laws and policies. So I'll stop here and I'll let Derik speak to this.
Thanks, Omid. I think in terms of, if I'm recalling some of the primary issues that you wanted to explore, Bayan, the idea of identity politics, and I think what you call these kind of two branches of identity politics, one sort of focusing on common humanity and then another one focusing on the common enemy. I would say that it's important to realize that identity politics is the game that has been played for centuries, right? I mean, the politics of Western modernity is one that is deeply, deeply rooted in a kind of identity politics. And so what you find is people attempting to play that game of, let's say, Western liberal democracy, the same game, which is sort of structuring Western liberal democracy and using those tools to advance agendas Now, I understand like why people do that. I personally, have a different sort of view of things, where I believe that, identity politics is a kind of limited horizon. The possibilities that are available to us through identity politics may be ultimately limited, partly because the structure that in some ways we're working against, right, is the structure of a kind of Western modernity, which is has done so much to elevate identity and to make it a means of exclusion and oppression, right? And so that if we simply abide by the rules of a rigged game, then we're destined to be the losers, I think. There's a pretty well-known quote from the poet and sort of intellectual activist Audre Lorde, which says that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so in some ways, I ultimately see identity politics as a form of using the master's tools. However, there's good reason that people have done that. And I think particularly, speaking from the sort of like the perspective of Black political history, right? There is a great fear that once Black people form, to use this term, allyships, right, with other groups, that there is a limitation on what can be accomplished, because the ally groups do not suffer the same kinds of particular sort of exclusions and oppressions as Black people do, and therefore, right, are not going to press as hard for the changes that need to come about as Black people themselves will, right? And so because of that, over time, there has developed a great deal of skepticism and suspicion of a kind of, let's say, cross identity alignment, right? Because of the belief that ultimately when push comes to shove, people are going to be left out on their own, right? And so that has bred, I think, a kind of, in some circles, a preference for less coalitional kinds of political movements, right? Ones and a kind of more let's say parochial types of political movements where it's group interest, which is primarily limited group interest, which is primarily being advanced. Yet at the same time, there are those who are at the forefront of political agitation who are aware of the necessity of political coalition, in forming sort of cadres of people who can bring about significant change, right? So those who are at the forefront are really, I think, sort of cognizant of the need to bring about changes in the policies and laws that Omid was talking about, and know that in order to accomplish that, they must have alliances with groups beyond their own particular interest group, right? And however, within those kinds of coalitions, those, let's say, complex coalitions, what you will see is that there is now an awareness of the need to center the experience and the voices of those that are most marginalized, right? So that if you look, it's very interesting, if you look closely at the actual agendas and platforms of something like the Black Lives Matter movement, of the sort of like the contemporary, right? There is an openness to coalitions with all kinds of different people, right? Yet at the same time, simultaneous to that, there's this need to center and elevate the experiences of the most marginalized. And in that context, right, we might be talking about Black transgender women, right? Those would be the most marginalized, right? And so within the kind of, you look into the sort of the granular details of the Black Lives Matter platform and so forth, you will see that those experiences are the ones that are most centered, right? And so that is following a kind of interesting logic that says that when the experiences of the most marginalized are foregrounded, and we can actually bring about equity and justice for those that are customarily most marginalized, then residually cascading from that, we're actually going to have the best outcomes for all involved, right? Because if we can ameliorate the situations of those who are most marginalized, then of course those who are not most marginalized are also going to be given their fair share of, sort of justice and equity, if that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? It's like we can't measure justice and equity by looking at those who have traditionally been privileged. We can only measure justice and equity by looking at those who have been traditionally most underprivileged. Right. So that's where the kind of focus is on now. So I would say that at the forefront of political agitation at this moment, there's a very sort of complex understanding of this relationship between sort of coalition and identity politics, Now, I think personally, a lot of the rhetoric in which these movements are couched still retain a kind of us and them dynamic, right? Where it's like there is a good group and then there's an out group, which is not good, right? And I think that is partly the result of a kind of natural human inclination to otherize, right? To want to sort of form group identity by villainizing an out group, by other group that we can galvanize our identity against, right? And I think that's a natural kind of thing that happens, right? I mean, that in order to sort of, draw together the 99%, we have to have the 1%, right, that we're fighting against, right? Yeah. And so that galvanizes a kind of intentionality and sort of a focus. And so that, I think that's a natural thing to happen. However, from my own perspective, and one that comes out of like the thinking of the Baha'i faith, right, what I'm most interested in are these kinds of the way in which power can be harnessed on mutualistic basis, right? We don't really think about that so much. We're so part of the master's house or the master's tools, right, is to get us to think in agonistic terms, right? Us and them. And so we study that, we think about that deeply. What we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, and we haven't studied as a sort of, in the body of knowledge that's out there, we haven't really studied the power of mutualism, right? Instead of power over, power with. And so, I think that as we go forward as a humanity, what we're going to sort of learn a lot about is what can be achieved through mutualistic power and thinking and learning about power with others than instead of power over or under others.
Thank you, both of you. I was just taking some notes. One part that I find would merit some more specificity, maybe, let's say. Maybe I should wait until Derik comes back.
Oh, he needs to plug in his laptop. I think he's running out of battery.
The limitations of technology.
There you go.
No, you're good. No problem at all. One part that I think deserves some more exploration is the idea of systemic versus localized racism. And what I would mean by that is the part that's interesting to me, and I think the part that is hardest to be specific about, meaning that when we refer to, or when someone refers to a systemic or institutionalized type of racism, meaning that the institution in and of itself, or the system in and of itself, has characteristics, laws, regulation, policies, whatever descriptor you would want to use, in place that are explicitly or implicitly racist or let's say discriminatory towards a specific group of people, versus localized would rather be, like if we talk about, systemic, the whole police force as a whole, let's say, versus localized, a particular officer or a particular precinct, or however we would want to describe it. So one question I would have for both of you, and I would like to start with you, Derik, would be how do we differentiate between the systemic or institutional type of racism versus a localized type of racism? And while you're making that distinction, what do you think are some specific things that you could point to, to describe what systems or institutions that currently are major systems or institutions within the US, let's say, are ones that have this institutionalized or systemic racism, and what are some specific characteristics that make it so?
So I think that so many of the social institutions which are key to the ordering of American society are poisoned by a kind of, to keep it very straightforward and simple, a kind of anti-Blackness, anti-Black ideology, right? And this is not because any individual may hold, as you were saying, right, a particularly virulent form of anti-Blackness, right? I mean, you can have a prison, like one of the ones that I teach in, which is an expression of anti-Blackness. Its actual kind of emergence, the emergence of the importance of the prison over the last 30 and 40 years, is the expression of an embedded kind of social anti-Blackness. Yet at the same time, right, you can have people who are working in that prison, right, who may be advocates for the dismantling of anti-Blackness, right? So you're working within an institution which is the expression of a kind of social ideology, and you are perpetuating its ideologies regardless of what you think, simply by working in it, right? So I think that sort of systems of anti-Blackness are going to be very hard to overcome ultimately, right? Without a fundamental change in the sort of the underpinnings of the system, the anti-Blackness, which kind of underpins that, and which is this kind of individually held sentiment. So that's a kind of paradox there. So on the one hand, you have these social institutions which are perpetuating anti-Blackness and which do it regardless of what the individual may feel, right? But then on the other hand, in order to undo those systems, right, you have to have individuals who are going to be rid of this kind of anti-Black ideology, right? So there's a kind of complex there, which leads me to the belief that there's got to be a simultaneous addressing of the systemic forms of racism and anti-Blackness, and then the individualized forms, right? So I don't think that we can segregate one from the other. Okay, so that's primarily my point, right? I don't think that what we can do is say that once we eradicate systemic anti-Blackness, we'll be fine. That will be fine, right? And at the same time, we can't say once we eradicate, all we have to do is eradicate anti-Blackness within the individual, and everything will be fine. That's not going to happen, right? Because right now, right, if in this moment all of us are sort of rid of anti-Blackness, right? Just imagine that everyone in the world that happens, right? We're still working within social institutions that will perpetuate, right, and target oppressions against Black people. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Because, for example, I'll take it with the law and order system, right?
Okay.
Let's say today everybody is kind of like rid of their anti-blackness. The way that law and order works, the way that the sort of apparatus of the state, which sort of enforces law, works, it will still remain targeted on those people, right, who come from certain communities, right, that happen to be low income, right, where you find mostly Black people. So people themselves might be rid of that anti-Blackness, yet at the same time, the way the system is set up right now, it will perpetuate anti-Blackness without individuals needing to sort of have anti-Black ideology. Does that make sense to you? Because of the way that it's imbricated with other sort of social phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes,
let's say, go ahead.
No, it does. I guess one quick follow-up question that I would have, just for the sake of my own learning through this as well, is, I mean, you gave an example right now of, the focus of police, for example, being on lower income area that are predominantly minorities, including Blacks. And so I guess in addition to that, for example, and maybe that's something that my dad in his answer could also specify, or Omid, I should say, would be that what are some, when we talk about a system or an institution, what are some specific examples that make them, a system that is anti-Black? Like how do we define that? What do we look at in order to determine whether an institution or a system is anti-Black or not, to use your own words? What would be the ruler, so to speak, that we say, these are the measurements that we use and this is how we determine that something is X versus Y, something like that?
I would say if it has a disproportionately negative impact on people who are Black, it's an anti-Black social institution.
Okay. So
can I also add to what Derik is saying?
Yes, of course.
I think, first of all, thank you, Derik. I think that was really good.
Yeah.
And I think that, as he said, we need to understand that systemic racism and individual racism, I would call it individual. I know you called it localized. I would rephrase it as individual. Racism are intimately connected. One speaks to moral suasion. And this is why I think as Baha'is in our Baha'i communities, we are so engaged in this aspect of it, the moral suasion of the community that we live in, the world as a whole, to understand the most central principle in the Baha'i faith, which is the oneness of humanity, which is connected to, I think, to everything else, in my opinion. And then you have systemic racism. And, I use the word racism. I know that Derik uses the word anti-Blackness, which is extremely appropriate for what we're seeing today. I would say anti-Blackness today in the US society is the highest expression of racism. And that's why we use that word, because when we want to talk about racism, and that could be very different in another part of the world, but in this country specifically, and what we're facing, the expression of racism, its highest expression, is right now in the form of anti-Blackness. So that is absolutely correct. But when we talk about systemic, we have to understand that it is possible, and we have to give possibility for both. You could have not racist individuals working in a very systemic racist institutions, And you could even have opposite. You could have an institution which tries to rid itself of systemic racism and yet have racist individuals functioning and working in that institution, right? So I think that's why the battle is two front. And I know I use these words that perhaps maybe you don't like, the words like battle and allies and
No, I
soldiers.
understand.
These are military terminology and maybe is not so appropriate for someone. I'm a member of the Baha'i community, and we are peace-loving, a community that believes in moral suasion. But I only use these words in very specific way, in very, its meaning has to do, the fight and the battle is with the institutions, systemic racism, rather than individuals that are racist. Individuals that are racist need moral suasion and education and love and being able to talk to each other and learn from each other, whereas systemic racism and institutions that are suffering from that may have to be dismantled and rebuilt again. Because sometimes it is very hard trying to use a Band-Aid aid of fixing an institution which maybe to its core is anti-Black. You just have to dismantle it and rebuild it again. By dismantling, you are not getting rid of it. You're just rebuilding it on proper grounds, on proper base, right? So that's one thing I wanted to say. Now, the idea which comes first, this has to be really the oldest question in the world, the egg or the chicken, which will ever come first. And there are two points of view. One point of view is change the world one heart at a time, right? And that speaks to the moral suasion. That speaks that we try to change hearts. As individuals change in the world, eventually the world as a whole will change. Now, definitely there is truth to that. Definitely it goes back to the concept of the trigger point, which I was speaking to. And it goes back to the concept of that once you get a certain amount of the population to believe in a specific thing, then it takes a curve that goes up, just like we talked about George Floyd and what happened as we're seeing it today. So there is definitely truth to that. But there is also a sense of moral justice, that this is a long process. And with this process, meanwhile, communities are suffering, individuals are suffering. And that speaks to the systemic racism, which must be addressed at the same time as the individual racism. Now, if you ask my personal opinion, this is my personal opinion, and I like a debate on this. I think actually that systemic institution has to change first. There comes the chicken or egg. So maybe I'm fighting for the egg. That has to come first. In other words, if we have certain amount of energy, what do we put it in? Do we say we put it 50-50? That we put moral suasion on one end and systemic institutional change in the other end, 50-50? I don't believe that. I think we should put more on the systemic change, because as systems change, it would make it easier for the moral suasion. It leads to that, it helps with that. And not only it helps with that, it allows communities that have been marginalized, and this specific case, we're talking about Black communities that have been marginalized for centuries, to have equal footing and opportunity to participate in this great democracy in a way that it was meant with. Now, your question is, how can we tell the difference, right? How can we tell the difference? Where are the signs? So one of the signs is we have to educate ourselves about the history of where things come from. If we investigate and face the truth of the history of things, then it allows us to maybe see systemic racism and anti-Blackness a little bit more clearly. For example, let me talk about Carl Brigham. Carl Brigham was an individual who wrote a book called A Study of American Intelligence. He wrote that book for one purpose and one purpose only, to show that the whites have a superior intelligence capacity than blacks. That was his intention. And he was working on studies that came before him, because those studies couldn't prove this concept. They fell short in their data, and he was going to prove that. Now, one thing that maybe a lot of people don't know, that Carl Brigham was also the author of the SAT. He instituted the SAT scores for universities to set as a standard of acceptance, as a standard of intelligence, as a standard of capacity of who can be successful in higher education and who cannot. So it's very eye-opening to see that the author of the SAT tests was the same person whose mission in his studies and books was to show that the whites are superior in intelligence than the blacks. So is it too much of a stretch to believe, therefore, his SAT tests are racially biased, very culturally biased? Now, all of a sudden, after, I think it was 1926 that he instituted that test. Now we're talking about close to 100 years later, 100 years. All of a sudden, universities and institutions of higher learning saying, wow, we honestly think that this standard of judgment of who can be a member of higher learning and who cannot is not a good standard, is a very racist standard. So during this now all of a sudden Brown University, University of Chicago, University of La Verne, I don't know what Claremont is doing, all these higher institutions of learning are beginning to say, you know what, this is terrible. We no longer use SATs as a standard of acceptance. We're gonna use many other metrics. We're going to look at the individual and the community he or she came from. We're going to look at his or her essay, the impact that they've made in their community and in their school. Because systemic racism wasn't only in acceptance of who can come to higher learning, but look at our public education, look at high schools. High schools, school systems are connected. It's like the whole system almost is rigged. School system, the budget of school systems is connected to what? Property taxes. Right? This is what we decided is going to. Property taxes has to do with the wealth of the community. So the higher, the more expensive the housing, the more expensive the neighborhood, the higher and the more money they have that they can use in their public education. So naturally, teachers get better paid, you have better facilities, you can have smaller class sizes. And they were wondering, oh, wow, why is it from these so-called elite high schools, more individuals are ready to go to universities than schools that are in inner city, communities? So now, all of a sudden, universities that are getting enlightened through this, the history they probably knew, but at least now they're using the history to create a justification for their actions, are saying, you know what, maybe capacity, maybe success needs to be evaluated in different terms. Now, that has to do with systemic racism, right? So you could have had in University of Chicago, which was asking for SAT to be one of their number one criteria, a lot of people who may have been also not racist. The admission officers could have been even Black admission officers that were very anti-racist, but they were serving in an institution which has racist policies. Mm-hmm. So that kind of a systemic racism then needs to be addressed, and vice versa. You could then all of a sudden have universities that become progressive, that begin to judge standard of acceptance in other ways that gives equal opportunity to communities of color in a way that in the past they were not given, and yet have a racist person in that institution. But that racist person, his or her hands are tied by making sure the policies, which could be correct anti-racist policies, are applied correctly. So therefore, it comes to my point of view, my argument that that what we need to do is address the systemic racism, not only at the same time, but even ahead of the moral suasion of individual racism. And again, one final point just to say, historically, has this happened? The answer is yes. Think of, for example, Obamacare. Obamacare, when President Obama first brought this universal healthcare idea, there was so much fight. Not only from the Republicans, but even from some of the Democrats, that this is not a good idea, this will not work, this will fail, so on and so forth. If you polled America, most of them maybe were not even for it, right? But now give the same poll today, and all of a sudden you notice that the needle has moved. A lot of Americans now believe in how Obamacare was the right thing to do, and it needs to be expanded. Now, universal healthcare is no longer the socialist taboo word that no one can talk about. Now it is a common theme. Now, it doesn't mean everybody believes in the same way, but you see how changing the system came before changing individuals. And as that system worked, individuals began to see how it affected their lives, and then they became allies of that proper thing. So that also finally speaks to what a lot of people are calling, dismantling the police departments or defunding the police departments. Let me make that one final comment. Again, first of all, how do we know if police departments are, you see, that's different. Systemic is policing police departments. Individual racism has to do with individual polices. And that's why I think it becomes, you see, then the leaders such as Derik, leaders, I don't consider myself leaders, but I talk to my students, we need to speak to make sure there is a clear distinction between these two. That when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about the institutions and how that needs to be dismantled and why it needs to be dismantled and what is the history of policing. Because as a lot of people say, bad apples in the police department. Yes, of course, a lot of police, I don't know them. And I'm sure there are 800,000 police in this country. And I'm sure many of them are fantastic. They're better individuals than I am. But they are part of a system that historically has been used to maintain power for status quo and to marginalize the communities that are under them to keep that power. So that's what we are referring to, or that's at least what I'm thinking about. Not individuals, but rather systems.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I took some notes on what you're saying, and I'll definitely get back to. I wanted to get back to something that Derik said earlier, and I thank you, Derik, for the frankness of your answer earlier to my question regarding a specific measuring tool to determine whether something is systemically anti-Black or not. And one, to kind of follow up on that, to preface my maybe retort would be too strong of an answer, but my challenge, let's say, would be a lot of times when I think about what kind of system or what kind of, let's say, world, if I want to generalize it too much, would I want to work towards, I would think about putting certain methods in place versus having certain outcomes in place. And what I mean by that is if we, for example, look at the judicial system, right? if I would consider a judicial system to be functioning properly, I would make that determination by looking at how the law is applied. If the law is applied justly and fairly across the board, regardless of the individual and who the individual is and where they came from and whatnot. Now, I know it's more complex than that. There's a lot that goes into it, but let's say, let's just focus on the one step of the sentencing, let's say, or the judicial process. To just focus on that one aspect for a second, I would say the judicial process functions properly when the process functions properly, not when the prison population, for example, is closely related to the actual population in terms of, let's say, percentage of representation. And the reason I say that is because, for example, if we use outcome as a measuring point to say that if and I would like to use your words, an institution would be considered anti-Black if it disproportionately negatively affects Black people, which I think is actually the right starting point. But I would say I would not consider it necessarily to be the right endpoint for the determination of whether it is anti-Black or not. Because, for example, the prison population in the US currently is overwhelmingly men as well. I mean, like, I would need to look at the exact numbers again, but if I remember correctly, over 90% easily of the prison population, for example, is men. Over 90% of victims of police shootings, whether justified or not, meaning whether it was in a shootout or whether it was someone fleeing the scene, were also men. And so if I were to use the outcome as a measuring stick to say, this is what I use to determine whether something has an ism or not, meaning racism, sexism, then I could make the case to say that our US judicial system is systemically sexist against men because the outcome of these indicators that I used, shootings, deaths by shootings from police officers or the prison population, are overwhelmingly men. Like, it's not even a close thing. It's not like 60-40. It's 90-10, 95-5. And so I guess my first point would kind of be, to me, the danger of using outcome as a measuring, as the end rather than the beginning of the determination, is that numbers can be sliced however you want them because there's always disparities between groups. If I compare white French to white Russians, I will, in almost every metrics that I will use, I will find some difference between the two. So, white French might make more money and white Russians might, I don't know, have more real estate, and white French might be more liberal. Like, I can always find, or sorry, that's not, the last one wasn't disparaging, but let's say difference in income, difference in outcome. So any two groups that I compare, even if I try to control the aspect of race, Asians from Malaysia versus Asians from Taiwan would have different outcomes. Blacks from, or Africans from Ghana versus Africans from Burkina Faso would have different outcomes. And so my first kind of, maybe a little bit of a challenging question would be, since I can use numbers and in almost any way that I can, and if they are the end, meaning they are the evidence of a systemic ism, racism, sexism, then would it be, for example, fair for me to make the case that our US government is systemically sexist against men? And if not, then what would be the difference? Like, why would one outcome mean something is systemically anti-Black, but another outcome not mean it is systemically sexist against men? How would you address that specifically for you, Derik, please?
Sure, I'll try my best. I'll say like a couple of kind of like caveats to begin with, right? Um, which is that I believe that we need to just dismantle the prison as a system, regardless. I don't think that I'm not satisfied with the prison so long as it equally distributes punishment among all the races proportional to their representation in the nation, right? So I think that the institution itself is an oppressive institution, right? And it's one that as a society, we must commit to moving beyond, right? And it's a failure of vision, and it's a indication of the limitation of vision that we believe that we must sort of subscribe to having a prison, right? It's unprecedented in human history. It's an experiment. It's an experiment that comes out of, I feel, a kind of racial panic of the 1960s and 70s, and it's one that we're working with right now. So I would say that, just in terms of orienting my own thinking. In terms of the question about the state, like the U.S. state, and its distribution, its disproportional focusing of the prison system on men, right? I think that that's undeniable. We can't ever deny that. And then you could say, well, it's a sexist institution, which targets men. But I think that that's a kind of overly rigid and simplistic thinking, right? Because what you could say is that the state, right, exercises means of social control over citizenship, right? The primary way that it exercises social control over lower income, right, and predominantly non-white men is through the law and order system with the prison and the police, right? The predominant way in which the state exercises social control over lower income and particularly non-white women in its population is through what we might call the social services system, right? In which welfare and so forth is doled out, but only if you submit to a certain degree of surveillance over your life, right? And so that for women, given sort of like the threats that disposable women present to society, it's much more efficient and much more easy for the state to deal with them through an alternative form of social control, mostly involving surveillance that is exercised through social service systems, right? Whereas the kind of threat that is presented to a society by disposable men, right, is best exercised through a very punitive and violent policing and prison system, right? So you see what I'm saying? So I think we have to zoom out and then see what actually the processes that are happening. It's not just that the state is trying to exercise control over populations which have been deemed unworthy of full inclusion into society. How does it do that? Well, it differentiates its methods according to certain requirements, right? The requirements of men are something different than the requirements of sort of controlling and dealing with disposable women, right? And so I think that, in my own opinion, this is how I think about it. There's a kind of subtlety which is necessary, right? Now, if going back to my sort of kind of provisional definition of an anti-Black institution, right? If it has this disproportionately negative outcome for Black people, right? Then I'd say, well, that's a kind of anti-Black institution. I say that's a provisional definition that we use for identifying social institutions which need radical rethinking, right? Which need to be dismantled, right? And I would leave it at that, right? I would say that if you want if you want to know where to look, just look at the social institutions which are producing these kinds of outcomes, time and time again, which have these negative outcomes for Black people. So, I mean, I just say that like to say that, yes, you can parse numbers any way you want to, what their, I don't know, the sort of the adage about statistics, but there's just one adage that I remember, everybody can sort of use statistics to prove whatever they want, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Numbers and so forth. But I think that that's a good starting point in terms of which systems we need to dismantle. Now, the more kind of profound thing to think about, right, is the way. Well, no, you know what? I'm not gonna go into that because I'll be opening up territory that I'm not really prepared to sort of fully unpack here. So I does that respond to something that you're getting at? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess one quick follow-up question I would have for you is how, like, the underlying question for me was more so that sometimes we can have methods in place that are the correct method with outcomes that are still unexpected. For example, one prevalent example would be in some Scandinavian countries, they have attempted to make the hurdles of society, as far as the hurdles for women are concerned, to as little as possible and level the playing field between men and women as far as education and career and stuff like that is concerned, as leveled as possible. And one of the interesting things of that was that, as social experiment, let's call it, was that the differences between the sexes actually, for example, increased rather than decreased, meaning that there was actually more disparity between men and women in certain fields of study or career, such as more women in nursing than men, more women in psychology or the humanities than men, and then some STEM field related careers that there was more men and women, and that differentiation between the two exaggerated when they leveled the playing field more. And so the method was the correct method, meaning that let's level the playing field so that there aren't artificial hurdles to women that men don't have, or vice versa, and that they should be free to choose what they want to. But the outcome was opposite of what they expected, because they thought it will diminish, but it actually increased. And so the underlying question that I would have for you is, I agree with you that if something disproportionately affects one population negatively versus the other, that needs to either be dismantled or investigated or changed or that mitigated, or it's not something that can be ignored. I agree with you 100%, regardless of the argument of that you can manipulate statistics to make any point. But how do we determine whether the correct method is in place or not, if sometimes, regardless of the method, outcomes can still be disproportionately different between groups of people?
Right. Which is to say that there's something sort of innate in the people themselves, right, which are going to produce the outcomes. Is that what that says?
Within the culture where they're from. I mean, it could be so many things. I'm not trying to make like a eugenics type point where some racial group is inferior to the other, and nothing like that, but more so that sometimes there have been cases where we did our best to implement the correct method, but that differences between groups were exaggerated rather than diminished. And so my underlying question is more, how do we differentiate between a method that is faulty, meaning a method that artificially produces bad outcomes, and a method that is good or correct as best as it can be, but still produces outcomes that we do not expect?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think first, there's if we are committed to ideals of justice and equity, right, then there is a responsibility. Yeah, I think that you've said this already, to look at those social institutions which produce bad outcomes for certain groups of people and determine how is it that we could make it sort of less negative for certain groups, right? And I think that you will say that. What you're saying is that the intuitive means of achieving those ameliorated outcomes are sometimes, in fact, not the way in which we can achieve the best outcome, right? This is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think that this is true, but that we need to try our best. Like, we need to sort of implement sort of alternatives to what exists, right? Now, then you can argue about what those alternatives are, but I think that the fact of the matter is that if we are going to say, well, there are these innate differences between people, and those innate differences tend to have disproportionately negative outcomes for, again, to sort of bring it specifically back to anti-Blackness, Black people, well, then there's nothing that we can do. My argument would be that, well, we need to change the social institutions. And if our methods, right, of changing these social institutions are not working, again, this is a personal standpoint, and this is a kind of idealistic vision. We need to change the very ordering of society, right, that produces negative outcomes through certain social institutions, regardless of how we may adjust them. And so this is where I was getting back to, kinds of large scale questions that I didn't really want to get into, but right. There is the possibility, right, that our way of sort of rewarding people, right, through social institutions, social rewards for doing certain kinds of activities, or what we award and reward, right, that in and of itself, right, is corrupted and is innately going to sort of favor one group over another, right? So our contemporary conceptions of knowledge, right? What knowledge is, usually this kind of faculty that we can simply sort of isolate to that which is above the eyebrows. You know what I mean? Like this kind of very cerebral, intellectual kinds of capacity, right? And we say that whoever possesses the most sophisticated form of that cerebral intellectual kind of capacity is deserving of the greatest reward in a society, right? Maybe that idea in and of itself, right, is something that needs to be explored, right? Maybe what we actually think of as knowledge, right, needs to be sort of dismantled and sort of re-understood, right? That there are forms of knowledge which have been, this term is, that there are ways of knowing and forms of knowledge which are epistemology. You call that like epistemology, right? And that we live in conditions which have over the last several hundred years at a global scale began to value certain kinds of epistemologies, ways of knowing, knowledges, right? Other ways of knowing and knowledges, right, which in other cultures and previous times have been sort of rewarded and honored. But in the context of Western modernity, those kinds of knowledges have been absolutely marginalized and devalued, right? And so now we have a society, and it's almost like a global culture now, which values only certain kinds of ways of knowing, and which will reward people for thinking in these ways, right? Maybe my thinking is, and this is perhaps utopian and idealistic, right, is that we need a total restructuring of what we deem worthy of sort of valuing materially, socially, what should be honored, what should not be honored, and so forth, right? So that again, this is opening up a kind of territory that is perhaps beyond our capacity to really deal with. But I think that you may be right that there may be social institutions which no matter what, right, they're going to produce negative outcomes for a certain kind of people, right, and for certain genders, or some biological kind of sort of characteristic is going to determine what their outcome is in relation to a certain social institution. What I think is that if that's the case, right, then that should lead us, if we're absolutely, as I am, committed to the oneness of humanity and justice and equity among all people, then we have to be committed to a reevaluation of the very foundations of like what we honor and what we, the ideals that we try and advance in a society. So this is my way of sort of giving you your point that, in fact, yes, there may be kinds of processes which we are usually esteeming in this culture, and which certain people may not be as well equipped to do as other people, right? Now, that's a kind of, that in itself is a kind of controversial idea, right? But I think that what I'm most interested in is working toward a society where the commitment to valuing all people, right, leads us to value the kinds of knowledges and the kinds of contributions that everyone can bring, to bear on a society, not just a certain group of people who have been acculturated and educated in a certain way can bring to society.
Absolutely. Don't worry, Omid. I'm getting to you right now.
Yeah, sorry to.
No, not at all. Thank you so
Omid.
much. No, not at all. We have so much time. I absolutely agree with you, Derik. I actually, to use some of your verbiage from the your article that I read earlier, the neoliberal marketplace definitely favors cerebral capacity, even though there are other people that are more labor intensive within the marketplace that produce equally valuable and arguably tangibly more valuable, because cerebral capacity is usually abstract, right? Like so I, as an accountant, my work is very abstract. There's not really much tangible things that I do. I don't build things. I don't clean things. I don't make things work properly. It's all abstract with numbers and how is what applied in which capacity. So I agree with you that I think our society, the neoliberal marketplace, is hyper-focused on cerebral capacity that sometimes has disparaging outcomes for people who deserve to be well respected within our society and not treated as, marginalized from an economic standpoint, just because the labor that they produce is not cerebral heavy, but manually heavy. To kind of piggyback off of some of the things that you said and go back to something that my dad was saying, where earlier he was, it's so hard to say Omid instead of my dad, that Omid was saying, was in relation.
You can say Dr. Furutan if you.
Dr. Furutan was saying was that one thing that you said that was really interesting to me, because it's actually almost in direct contradiction to something that you wrote in your research paper, which was that you would put the system first because you think that the top-down and this is my interpretation, so I want to give you the chance to clarify and correct me, but that the top-down pressure would kind of ingrain a sense of realization to, that this was the right thing, that we start with the system and that the individuals will follow, so to speak, the chicken and egg argument. And so, but what's interesting to me is in your research, in your own research paper, you indicated that the legality or illegality of practices as far as business practices are concerned were actually not a good determination of how the people themselves think about moral things, like that if laws were stricter, there wasn't a direct relationship that people automatically would also make more moral decisions, and that it was actually, I mean, please speak to it yourself more, but that I remember that the relationship was not together, and that actually it would further separate, like if laws became stricter, the aspect of what they think is moral or immoral as far as business practices are concerned kind of stayed constant, and it just created a further separation between the abstraction of law and the applicable the applicable nature of morals within the workplace. And so to kind of build off of that argument that you were making and giving you the chance to clarify, how do you think that relationship would play out? Do you think that, as you determined with business moral, the application of morals within business versus the laws, that the laws will actually, like, what do you think would be the difference here, that the system first aspect of morality would have a positive relationship to people's individual morality versus the determination that you made from business law versus business morality, that those were not directly related like that?
Yeah. Let me first speak to that paper specifically and what it was trying to, the thesis that it was trying to prove was that, not that which comes first. It was only trying to show that whenever you have, because you have informal rules and laws, and then you have formal rules and laws. Mm-hmm. And that paper and the data in that paper was showing that the greater the difference between these two, the more corrupt the institutions get, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a correlation between how the distance between these two will have a direct effect on the corruption in the institutions in that society. Mm-hmm. And the conclusion was that these two need to work together. So if this one is going this way, this has to come with it. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the moral suasion I was talking about. The moral suasion is intimately connected to the institution. My point that I was mentioning here was that individuals who only concentrate on this part, saying this is the key to everything, that as soon as this happens, it will automatically push this one ahead. That I'm saying that's not necessarily the case. Mm-hmm. That we have historical evidence that they kind of play together. Sometimes as this goes this way, it pulls this way sometimes, but not that you just allow it to be the only pull by itself. And at the same time, you don't expect that all we do is push one, hoping that it will push the other one forward too. Mm-hmm. So that's to that paper. Now, let me come back more specifically to the things that we were speaking about. You know, one of the questions you had is like, what is it that we want to see, the outcome? Right? Mm-hmm. And should the outcome speak to the process? So I think what is lacking here are a couple of things. One is that if you have lack of vision or a common goal, the outcomes becomes muddy. So we don't know what outcome you're speaking of. Do we mean the outcome is that every Black family now has a medium income that is equal to every white family? And then we say, oh yeah, that's the outcome. So let's see how we can achieve that. So we need to have a common vision, and that's what we're lacking a little bit as far as I don't mean here, I mean society as a whole, lack of vision of what that outcome is. The second thing is that when we talk about innate differences among people, it is important that we distinguish this, because of course there are innate differences between people, but somehow that bleeds into people think there is innate differences between racial groups. Mm-hmm. See, we're not talking about individuals, but sometimes that bleeds into racial groups. Now, let me just speak to you about one recent study two French mathematicians have done. Recent means 3, 4 years, 4, 5 years old, okay? So that's the recent about it. And they can do it because now we have the aid of supercomputers to run very complex data that we couldn't run in the past. Now, these two French mathematicians came up with the idea that we need to study why we have dual economy. Now, by dual economy is that no matter how do we look at the economy, both in the macro and the micro, you have always created the duality of wealth getting concentrated in a very small percentage of population. This is where Pareto, which was an Italian economist, he's passed away a long time ago, we call it the Pareto's curve. So the curve going this way, which means a very, very small population in all economies, both macro and micro, usually hold majority of the wealth within that economy. So he came up usually with numbers with it. We could call it, for example, 40-80, which means, and it doesn't have to equal to 100. That's the mistake some people make. So 40-80 means that 40% of the population hold 80% of the wealth within that society. Now, what we do know is through Pareto's curve that that society usually collapses economically, and we have seen it in our society to 2008, go back to the Depression, so on and so forth, collapses when it hits a certain proportion, usually is 95-5. When 95% of the population, the wealth is in the hand of 5% of the population, economy usually collapses. It's not sustainable. So these mathematicians wanted to look for reasons why this is happening, what we call economic cycles keep happening. But of course they needed, as you said, a common outcome, right? Because unless you have a common outcome, you cannot investigate what the problem could be. And that's what the common vision came. I'm gonna, if you give me a little time, I'm gonna speak to that when it comes to racial justice too. But now we're talking specifically economics. So the common outcome was for these mathematicians that we want to have a more equitable society. Not that everyone has the same wealth, but the numbers they were looking at was more like 60-40, okay? Not 80-20, not 95-90. They realized that, of course, wealth be more concentrated in some hands than other hands. And now they say, let's come up with criteria of why this wealth would move around, right? They came up with 40 criteria. I'm not going to mention all of them, but I'll mention some of them so you know what they were thinking. They said, for example, inheritance is one, how wealth moves. Access to capital is another one, how it moves. Education is another, how it moves. Even inheritance, I don't know if I just mentioned inheritance or not, or even luck has to do with it too. Maybe you make an investment and you're lucky because the market was moving in that. So they came with 40 criteria and they investigated that from their social science department. They said, come up with all these criteria. So they built a society using supercomputers. They would run this society for about 100 years or even longer, right? So first they randomly, to this society, they randomly assigned certain number of these 40 criteria. So an individual could have from 0 to 100, 100 wealth, 50 inheritance, 20 luck, so on and so forth, right? But it was randomly distributed. And then they ran the experiment, they led the society using economic connection and network that we apply today through systems we have developed from Wealth of Nations, the book Wealth of Nations, and through Adam Smith's economic principles, right? They let it run, which is right now our economy is based upon that free market understanding of the invisible hand, which he speaks about. They run. They noticed that after so many years, dual economy was created. Interesting. They said, what if we give everyone the same amount of, let's say, wealth to begin with, right? It took a little bit longer, dual economy was created. They say, what if we make 3 of the criteria exactly the same? Let's say education, let's say in starting wealth, and let's say inheritance. It took a little longer, but dual economy was created. To make a long story short, the paper shows no matter how much they tried to create equity among all these people, at the end, when they were running the system, it just took longer, it created dual economy. Their conclusion, that is not about the equity within the system. The system is designed to create dual economy, no matter what. It is by design that it is doing that, right? Now, what was the outcome they were looking for? They said a fair and a just outcome is equal distribution, equity in a way that makes sense. But no matter how much they made the micro part of the system equal, the macro always created what the outcome was not desired, which was the duality of the economy. Now, going back to what we were talking about here, justice, racial justice. Now, if we talk about outcome, and you were saying, what is the outcome? How do we judge outcome? So if we have a common vision that the outcome understands that individual differences exist, but once you have racial differences, in other words, differences are concentrated within racial groups, then you know that that's not the outcome you want. That's not the desired outcome. So the desired outcome is not, no matter how we look at fairness, and what if the judicial system had this, that's the micro part, and we did sentencing like this, and we did policing like this. If the outcome still is that 90%, 95% of the prison population is Black men, then we say that outcome is not desirable. Something is wrong within the system, even if you try to correct the micro part of the system and say, what about sentencing? How do we make sentencing in a way that works? I think what I liked about what Derik was saying is that could speak to the system as a whole. That could speak to the way we do reward and punishment. Every society needs rewards and punishment, but if the outcome keeps creating results that are racially biased, then we say, wow, maybe the whole concept of reward and punishment needs to be reevaluated. And what are we doing in this regards? You talked about like white French, you said that, and what about white Russians? And does it speak to white people if we do this or that? We're comparing apples and oranges because the white French are not in the same society as the white Russians. They live in totally two different societies. But if you say white French versus the African French that came from Africa, and all of a sudden we look at the French society and we say, oh my God, that the African French community is experiencing French society in a way that racial group keeps getting marginalized in many aspects of society, then we can say, is that the outcome we want? Then let it be outcome driven in that sense. Let me just finish a couple of more things and then you can come back to it. Sure. So, because I wrote a lot, but I don't know. So again, this goes back to how do you judge correctness? That's something you mentioned. How do we judge correctness? This goes also back to we need to reevaluate of how we understand fairness. Because if you ask, what does it mean to be fair? It would be very different from individual to individual, right? That goes back to the common vision. Some look at fairness as equal leveling play. So they say, if you have that equality in that sense, that's fair. Others look at fairness more in concept of equity. And equity maybe gives it a little bit more color, more complexity, and saying, well, equity is not exactly the same as fairness. Equity speaks with different tone, in a different language, that is not about equal playing field, but rather, again, what do we want in a society? when it comes to a common vision and a common goal. And equity means principles and ways to get there, right? And how do we get there? So I have also a lot more notes. I'm gonna forget that. I'm not gonna go into the other notes that I had, but I just wanted to say that through that study that we saw recently published in a very, very, a journal, a very respected journal of mathematics, shows that you can change the micro as much as you want to create equality. But if the system itself is designed to create a certain outcome, it will always create that outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Bayan, if I can just jump in there, because
yes, of course.
I was thinking, like, what Omid was saying is a kind of concretization of the idea that I was kind of expressing without as much, I think, sort of clarity, actually, which is that this is we operate within a worldwide sort of system. You can call it whatever you want to, sort of neoliberal, sort of global capitalism with an ideal of liberal democracy, right? Something like that, right? Which we take to be the kind of highest form of social organization which is possible, right? But my belief is that actually that is simply one form of social organization which we have come to accept as the kind of the totality of possibilities, right? Mm-hmm. If we are not committed to a fundamental restructuring of those systems, right? The actual kind of, this sort of social, economic, and I would say sort of fundamentally moral, spiritual sort of system, right? That we are going to find ourselves sort of perpetuating kinds of inequalities over and over and over again, right? And that because of the central role that race has played in shaping the extant system, right? Global capitalism is inextricable from a racialized form of, let's say, labor distribution, right? Blackness was at the beginnings of global capitalism a marker which designated you as unworthy of remuneration for your labor, right? However far we move within this extant system, Blackness will always be associated with a lesser a status of sort of labor. Its value will always be sort of valued as less than another form of labor, because I would argue it's rooted right in that fundamental kind of the seed moment, if you will, of the system which we operate under today, right? So what I'm saying is that what we need is like to sort of really truly address these systems. We have to think about a total sort of imagination of the system that goes beyond any individual social institution, right? Which down to kind of like a root fundamental reevaluation. Okay, which is hard to imagine. It's hard to us to even think in those terms, I think. But I think that's ultimately what's necessary, right? In terms of the evolution of racism over, a kind of, again, I say anti-Blackness because it's the one that it's a kind of racism that I understand more, powerfully than other kinds, So that's the reason I'm saying that. I keep on referring to anti-Blackness. It is going to be here regardless of the way that we change any individual system, right? We know that when you got rid of this pervasive system of chattel slavery, that was pretty much abolished throughout the world in the 19th century, that didn't do away with the underlying, it was only the expression of anti-Blackness, right? It was the social institution in which anti-Blackness kind of coalesced, right? But after that social institution was transformed, right, anti-Blackness manifested in different ways, in different social institutions. And when we dismantle policing as it operates right now, right, that will be a great thing. It will be good, right? But if I understand power correctly, having oppressive power, having sort of observed its operation over the last 500 years, I mean, what I think will happen is that anti-Blackness will simply reorganize itself in another social institution and will express itself in that way, right? So on the one hand, I agree with Omid, like the chicken and egg situation, right? I think we have to always be dismantling these systems, right? But simultaneously to that, we have to be attendant to these more fundamental questions of like what lies beneath these institutions, what lies in the hearts of human beings, right? However, the reason that I think that we should really focus on dismantling systems is because I think it's easier to actually sort of work on changing hearts, right, while you're attempting to change a system. And it's not so easy to change a system if you're only focused on changing hearts, right? Like I feel as though like you can weave in the changing of hearts to your work as you dismantle systems. Whereas if you're focused on changing hearts, it's not as easy to work on dismantling systems, if that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? So, I just wanted to add that in to sort of draw on what Omid was saying to kind of maybe clarify a little bit of what I was trying to say before.
Yes, absolutely. We're starting to approach the 2-hour mark, so I wanna give a quick chance for closing remarks. But I just wanted to say that one thing that I definitely think I learned during the conversation with you two is that the challenging thing for me was always to see the systemic aspect of something when it was not really in the system itself, in the sense of like, for example, you know, if I think about a meritocracy, you know, I would say if you work hard, like output over input should be relatively equal across the board, meaning that the amount of output that you get, let's call it wealth or influence or success or whatever measurement you would use, should be determined by your input, not by your characteristics, right? Not by whether you're gay or white or black or whatever, right? But one thing that I think is a good way to look at it is the idea of a meritocracy is not necessarily incorrect, right? But how that meritocracy functions and what is determined to be a fair output of what kind of input is the question that we're supposed to be having, meaning that what kind of input do we determine to be deserving of a valuable output? What kind of, meaning that's kind of what I think you were saying earlier too, Derik, meaning that if cerebral input is deemed more valuable than other kind of input, and so even if the level of exertion or input in an abstract sense might be the same, the outcome is different in a way that is not sustainable, right? It's not like one guy makes 100 grand, the other guy makes 120 grand, both are happy. It's like one guy makes 20 grand and the other one makes 850. So the difference between the outcomes is so far apart that there's not a fair relationship between input and output when we look at what kinds of inputs have what kinds of outputs. And so I think the systemic aspect of it is not necessarily that we would want to move away from a meritocracy or move away from a system that is based on, this might sound harsher than I mean it, but people getting what they deserve, right? You work hard, you should be able to reap the benefits of your labor, but rather that we need to reevaluate how we distribute the outcome and how we value the input in order to make sure that we don't have a population that is disenfranchised and a population that is not rewarded properly for their input or punished improperly for their input, and that the reevaluation starts there, and not that the meritocracy in and of itself is a form of systemic racism or bias, but that how that meritocracy is applied is what determines whether it is systemically, let's say, anti-Black or racist or not. Would that be a fair summarization of kind of what we've been discussing so far? From that aspect of it, the economic and outcome aspect of it, let's say.
Sure. I mean, I think I like the way that you sort of broke that down in terms of the inputs into the meritocracies, into a meritocracy, sort of having some relationship to the outcomes through that meritocratic system, right? Mm-hmm. But the one thing that I would say is that we also need like a kind of reorientation toward like what we want from basically the life and the world, right? Because once you start to say, okay, this guy's labor, right, should be valued at a much higher value than it is right now, if it's not tied to a fundamental desire to see the flourishing of all human beings, right, then all we get is resentment. Right. And then it's kind of like, oh, well, you know, what we're doing is we're tilting the system in the favor of someone because, you know, we have pity on that person. Mm-hmm. If we can't see the way in which the flourishing of every human being is connected to our own flourishing, right, mm-hmm. then the kinds of systems that we set up to have more equitable kinds of meritocracies are ultimately going to break down. Right. You see what I'm saying? So it's like people have to get beyond a kind of individualistic, kind of simplistic understanding of what is possible, I think, in human life, right? Mm-hmm. For us to build these kinds of, you know, these systems that you're talking about where the meritocracy would be like my work, my labor is actually valued in a way that allows me to have a foundation for actual flourishing, mm-hmm. right? And not mm-hmm. and not one that kind of like actually doesn't give me the possibility for flourishing, but gives an overabundance of that possibility to a guy who simply does another kind of labor.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think with that, if either of you two had any closing remarks before we move on with our days, I would like to give either of you the chance to do that.
Okay, so maybe I can say that, first of all, thank you for creating this forum for three of us to discuss this. I personally have learned a lot from both of you, and I thank you for that. And I wanted to end by saying that, and I think continuing what Derik was just saying, is that it all comes back to that common vision, common goal. And as a member of the Baha'i community, I'm a Baha'i, and this faith of mine informs me about many things. It has influenced a lot of my thoughts, my actions, and what I believe in is guiding me through of how I navigate through life and navigate through this issue specifically that we're speaking about. So the central theme of the Baha'i faith, which is the oneness of humanity, that common core plays itself in so many things that we have spoken about. And I think every problem that at least we have spoken about is a fragment of what has shattered for humanity, not really concentrating on this single issue that, as what Derik was saying, we are all spiritual beings, and that the oneness of humanity is that common core that then must play itself out in our economics, in our social system, in our judicial system, in everything. So I just want to give a shout out to my faith and how it has influenced me and how it continues to influence me. And I welcome everyone to look into that and see how it can contribute to their way of thinking.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Omid has said. Really great thanks for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. Very sort of stimulating and thought-provoking. And I love the clarity of logic that both you, Bayan, and Omid bring to these kinds of discussions. Is good for me because I can be a little bit more, let's say, I don't know, creative in my thinking, and it's very grounding for me to sort of have to think through the logical steps that may gird the thinking that I'm trying to do. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all and participate in that kind of discussion. So I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for having me here with you, Bayan and Omid.
Absolutely. Thank both of you. I truly thank both of you as well. This was a great conversation. As you said, very stimulating, very enlightening. And I think one great aspect of it was also the civility and the respect that we show each other. And I think that is the best way to talk about difficult things like this, regardless of whether you agree on every detail or not. And so I also want to thank both of you for the capacity to, converse respectfully and civilly, and that we had a very good and stimulating conversation. And I hope that whoever listens to this will also enjoy it. And you guys need to help out. You guys need to send this to your friends and your family and everything too, because I get like an average of 8 views. So we we need to bring it up. Yeah. But anyway, thank you, and I think that's it.
Thanks a lot, Bayan.
Thanks
Thank you.